So we are in week 4 of a series that we're calling Holy Chaos, Creating Connections in Divisive Times. And the idea for this series came from a book by a woman by the name of Amanda Henderson. Amanda is a disciples minister in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And through her book, she has this wonderful way of inviting us to wonder what might happen if we brought our fullest sense, our most deepest loving self, to all of the difficult and chaotic spaces that we find ourselves in. And we are certainly in one of those times, aren't we? With the pandemic, with the social unrest, with the deeply divisive election cycle that we find ourselves in. These are unprecedented times for sure. As the poet Robert Frost once said, the only way out is through. And I would push us a little farther and say that the only way through is together. But what makes this time so difficult, isn't it, is that oftentimes our reaction in moments like this would be to come together, to bind ourselves together, to find times and places and ways that we can come together to create those connections. But now we are being asked to socially distance ourselves, which only seems to compound the problems. Today, I want to invite us to think about the issue of curiosity. Because not only are we socially distanced, I would argue that we are living in a time when we are more ideologically divided than we've been perhaps in generations. And by that I mean sometimes it feels, doesn't it, like we are living in different worlds, depending on which news we watch, the circle of friends with which we surround ourselves. And not only are we deeply divided, but we are deeply entrenched. Studies and polls show that only a tiny percentage of people in the middle are even open to movement in any way, shape, or form when it comes to the most divisive of issues. I don't have to name what those issues are. You know them already. And the fact is that people, by and large, are not moved by facts or statistics. And yet a recent study published in a journal called Advances in Political Psychology said that the only antidote to this politically entrenched ideology is curiosity. Now, today's scripture is relatively short. Now, you would assume that would mean that it would be a short sermon. But you know me better than that. It doesn't always work that way. I don't want you to get your hopes up. The text today comes from the Sermon on the Mount, which is the longest section of teaching in the Gospels. And many scholars believe it to be the essential Jesus, the Cliff Notes version of the Gospel, if you will. One of the themes that seems to run not only through the Sermon on the Mount, but through all of the Gospels, is that throughout the story that there were these people that were curious to know who Jesus is and what his life is about, what it means, not just for them, but also for us. From shepherds to tax collectors to women in need of healing, they would continually approach Jesus to experience this mysterious wonder and works that they had heard about. And then in chapter 7 of Matthew, Jesus says this: "Ask, and it will be given to you. Search, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened for you. For everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds. For everyone who knocks, the door will be opened." Now I suspect that when Jesus said this, it was not a one-time invitation, but rather it was a call to continually seek the ways of God from a posture of humility, of not knowing. You see, for many Christians, this is a call to curiosity, to deepen our understanding of what it means to follow God, what it means to live out the great commandment, to love one another as we love ourselves. I think in part what Jesus was saying is that without a spirit of curiosity, we can never discover the deep things of life, the deep connections of God that are tucked beneath the banal surface of life. Curiosity has a way of taking us deeper, and going deeper is always important, perhaps now more than ever. I think that for far too long, this church has sounded a lot like a public swimming pool. And by that I mean that most of the noise seems to come from the shallow end. You see, questions of God and other people are essential to what it means to be a person of faith. To not have questions about God is less an indication of a confident faith and more of a lack of spiritual depth. That's why I'm a firm believer that doubt is not the opposite of faith, but a very important element of it. As Friedrich Buechner says, that doubt is the ants in the pants of faith. You see, because certainty ultimately is the opposite of faith. In the life of faith, questions are oftentimes more important than answers. And this is true not just in the Christian faith, but across the religious spectrum. My rabbi friend reminds me that questioning is at the heart of the Jewish practice. The early Jewish community was based around life in the temple, but when the temple was destroyed in the first century, Jewish communities had to reorient themselves to figure out what life was about, to discover a new collective commitment. And during that era that is now known as the rabbinic period, that unifying force was around education, around learning the Torah and Midrash and the Talmud. To this day, questioning and curiosity, debate is central to the Jewish tradition. As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says, when faith suppresses questions, it dies. When it accepts superficial answers, it withers. Faith is not opposed to questions, but it is opposed to shallow certainty that what we understand is all that there is. Not just Jewish circles, but the Buddha too was known to have taught the practice of patience as being central towards the path towards enlightenment. And by patience, I don't mean a passive wait-and-see sort of posture, but rather patience as an artist or a musician continually, constantly working on their craft. And the Dalai Lama was once involved in a question and answer period, and a question was asked of him, and he thought for a moment, was silent. And that silence lasted an uncomfortable length of time until finally he simply said, "I don't know." How refreshing, how great is that how inspiring that this humility, that he is humble enough to admit that he doesn't have all the answers. You see, curiosity is a form of humility. It's a lifelong acknowledgement that there is always more to learn. That is true in religion. It's also true in relationships as well. Melissa Schroeder is a professor at the Bob Schieffer College of Communications across the street at TCU. And she said in the most recent TCU alumni magazine, curiosity, humility, and respect are important foundations for creating shared understandings about differences. Psychiatrist Alfred Margulies once proposed that that curiosity is really what's required to understand another human being. Wonder, he wrote, promotes a searching attitude of simultaneously knowing and not knowing. That wonder, it blends astonishment with curiosity. This compelling combination that ends up enabling a deep appreciation for the other person. In other words, wonder and curiosity keep us from behaving as if as if we have everyone else all figured out. However, I would argue that the exact opposite of this searching attitude is what plays out in much of the political and oftentimes partisan dialogue that tends to be rampant in our culture today. Dan Cahan is a professor of law and psychology at Yale. And he has shown that using information and analysis to try and change someone's political viewpoint, that 99 times out of 100, all that you do is simply entrench them even deeper into their understanding and their deeply held beliefs. The only antidote to this, he says, the only antidote is curiosity. This curious mindset that opens us up to exploration, a surprise that leads us well beyond our desires to simply confirm what we already believe. And so what if instead we decided to do what Walt Whitman said and be curious and not judgmental? Glennon Doyle Melton once said that when people express opinions that differ from yours, take it as a chance to grow. Seek to understand over being understood. Be curious and not defensive. The only way to disarm another human being is by listening. And philosopher Michael Foucault identifies the social value of the function of curiosity. He says curiosity evokes the care that one takes of what exists and what might exist. He goes on to suggest that our curiosity about the lives of other people can be a source of empathy and a source of cooperation, and both of which are in short supply these days. Our community, our culture, our nation is in desperate need of empathy and cooperation. Fred Kaufman is a business philosopher, and he speaks about the difference between learners and knowers. Knowers, he says, they receive their self-worth, their identity from simply being right, holding the complete truth. They regard anyone who disagrees with them as inferior at best and as an enemy at worst, because their truth simply cannot be challenged. They express their beliefs as indisputable facts, without any room for humility or growth. Let me ask you, do you know someone like that? Are you someone like that? Now, learners, on the other hand, experience their self-worth based on the ability to acquire new knowledge, to grow. They understand that they hold only one piece of the complete story, that they spend more time listening and less time talking. They spend more time gathering information and insights so that they can partner with other people with different views in order to find middle ground, to work together, to meet shared goals. You see, I'm willing to suggest that the best leaders are learners. They embrace curiosity because the more that we can build relationships across those differences, the more that we can work together, the better that we can make progress on some of the most pressing issues of our time. Amanda says in her book, curiosity has the power to open minds and transform lives. Curiosity is distinctly different from judgment or fear, which both narrow our vision and clench our truth in our fist. Curiosity is an open hand reaching out to know more and to be in relationship. So what would it look like in your life to cultivate curiosity? In your life, in your relationships, how could embracing a spirit and practice of curiosity help build partnerships, help build relationships across our differences? Amanda offers a few suggestions. The first is that when the going gets rough, turn to wonder. When the going gets rough, turn to wonder. When we feel that judgment creeping in, when someone says something that strikes us as offensive or uninformed, what if in that moment we ask, I wonder what in their experience has led them to feel this way? The second thing she says is to practice asking why. To practice asking why. Someone once said, knowledge is having the right answer. Intelligence is asking the right question. Don't be afraid of looking silly by simply asking questions. Whether you are seeking a solution to an entrenched problem or simply getting to know someone new, the practice of asking good questions helps us explore the multitude, the layers of not just the issue, but also the person. Realizing that the more you know, the more you don't know is actually a pretty excellent place to be. And thirdly, practice saying less. According to the ancient Greek philosopher Epictetus, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. The practice of listening without planning what you are going to say next. It builds our skills for actually being curious about what other people are saying. It strengthens our understanding and our ability to care for one another. It also makes us more enjoyable to be around. I would much rather be interested than interesting. You see, it is imperative that as people of faith, that we wrestle with these hard questions. And that's why so many people, so many stories in the Bible are about regular people wrestling with God, wrestling with their humanity, and discovering the joy that is in the searching. Friends, in these chaotic, divisive times, we simply cannot, as a congregation, as a community, as a country, we cannot remain entrenched in the ways in which have divided us, the ways that have pushed so many people to the margins. Our call as people of faith, is to see beyond what we know, to create connection, to embrace curiosity, and to live into these habits that move us all towards the wholeness that God intends for our lives, the wholeness that God intends for our world.